Hey, I'm Nick.
And I'm Graham.
And this is the Dude, Where's My Code podcast. And this is episode number 10. And it's the first one that we have with a guest.
Yeah, our guest is Tina Fletcher. I've known Tina for a while now, but we don't actually often talk about management things. We're in a software testing association together on the board. So a little while ago, I saw Tina post something on LinkedIn about team communication and their communication being so good that they have made stand-ups redundant. And I was so intrigued by that, so much so that I think maybe we painted her in a stand-up hating light. But we ended up having a great conversation about team collaboration, and I'm thrilled for everyone to hear it.
Yeah, we think that you'll really enjoy it. And if you could do us a favor and like the video, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, and we'll get back to you. But it's going to be awesome, so enjoy.
So I guess maybe to kick it off, Tina, first, thanks for being willing to come chat with us today. I think I was telling Nick, I saw, and I always screw up like the quote, so I'm going to get it wrong again, but I saw something that you had written or said about the way you run communication on your teams. And I think what caught me was like, just that hook of like, we found that stand-ups were redundant and unnecessary. And I was like, oh, and I think I wrote on a whiteboard like that day, like, what would it take to make stand-ups redundant? And I haven't achieved it yet. So I'm pretty excited to be able to hear kind of the journey that you've gone through, especially if this has evolved through kind of the process of going remote. I don't really remember like if you were before, if your team was before, if this was all post-pandemic, but the like remote aspect of the team communication and still being able to have stand-ups redundant really, really intrigues me. So I'm kind of stoked to hear more about that, actually.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. It's exciting to think that, something I posted on LinkedIn could make it onto your whiteboard as like a philosophical question.
Very much so.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think as Graham was saying too, I had a lot of the same curiosity about it. I've had some experience in the past where teams I was managing were kind of in that same boat where it felt like a stand-up would be redundant. I told Graham, like, I'm very interested if there's any remote portion. Like, I don't know if the teams that you're working with are remote, or even if it's interactions, say, like with just folks outside of the immediate team, like that remote piece. All of that is fascinating to me because right now I feel like I'm in a position with the teams I work with where like the stand-ups feel like they have to be there because we don't have that same level of communication. So
yeah, well, I think so. For me, this is something I've only felt with my current team. So this is the only team I've been on where I didn't feel a need for a daily stand-up. I know for sure that feeling of like, wow, if we didn't all come together in the morning for the stand-up, I don't know how we would stay on track, stay on the same page. Like, for a lot of teams, I think that is really a critical piece of how they communicate. And for a long time, I thought it was sort of mandatory in an engineering team. I had never seen it not done. And so, yeah, I think that for me, this has been a bit of an experiment too. And I'm still, we like to keep things flexible in the day-to-day and in how we work together and stuff. And I'm very much a proponent of, if anything feels awkward or like it's not working, then let's just iterate on it and experiment and see if we can fix it. And I thought that no stand-ups might be just one of those short-term phases, but it's been going on for over 2 years now, and I don't feel like we need them.
I don't know if Nick will remember this, or maybe if you had the same feelings that I did, but something you said about stand-ups feeling almost like mandatory in engineering teams. And I know we worked on a team where we all sat in like 4 cubicles, like open cubicles beside each other. And all 4 of us would be in the morning, and we'd have just been chatting about stuff related to work and like where things are at. And then someone would be like, oh, I guess it's 9 o'clock. We got to do stand-up now. And it would just be this like, the conversation had this moment where it's like, and now it's stand-up. And then we would still talk about what we were talking about, which was the state of what we were working on. And that I think very much is that like, it has to happen. But actually we were kind of already in sync with with what was going on. I don't know if you got that impression, Nick, but
Yeah, no, that's sort of exactly what I was thinking, and that's the reason why too for me that thinking about it from a remote perspective is completely different because I associate why that worked very well with the fact that we could literally turn and like we would all be right there. You were constantly talking. Like you could tell if someone was, trying to debug something or they were stuck on something because you could look over and they would be doing this. I like to say that's why I don't have hair here is because I would hold my head. I'm going to keep saying that. But, you could tell when people were, working through problems and stuff, just because you had all of this extra context of being in person. And I'm not saying that being in person is the only way to do it, but I feel like we got lucky because we had that capability. So
I have to know, like, I mean, you don't have to give us like a rundown of the team days or anything, but I am curious, like, what are the things, like, what kinds of activities are taking place that keep people in sync, and are there times where you have to do anything deliberate to fill the gaps, even if it's not a stand-up?
Yeah, so I feel like there's a few different angles or categories or like buckets of things that we do on the team that make the stand-ups feel redundant. One is, without going into super painful detail about what every day in the life of my team is like, there are other times throughout the week where we sync up as a team. And in all of those sync ups, there's either sort of implicit or sometimes explicit opportunities to say, what are you in the middle of right now? What are you stuck on right now? What are you planning to do next? Like those typical stand-up questions. And so, like, you might argue that we sort of maybe are having a stand-up in a way, even though it's not at the same time or in the morning or constrained to 15 minutes or that being the only focus. It's just we happen to discuss those kinds of things in the course of other like meetings or discussions that we have as a team. So that's one aspect of it, is that
you just don't have a scrum master like standing there saying like, that's not part of the 3 questions, like move on. Like, is that the
yeah, and it's not like your turn, your turn, your turn.
Right.
It's like
right.
If somebody has something on one of those topics that they want to bring up, then there are natural opportunities for them to do so, but it's not so structured, and we just don't label it as such, I guess. Like
Right.
the goal of the meetings will be something else. Like, for one example, it's our weekly dev demo meeting, right? And so the point is showing what you worked on this week. So if you attend the meeting and listen to what people are saying, you'll pick up stuff like, well, this is how far I got this week because I'm only showing you up to this point. And, the reason I only got this far was because yesterday I was totally stuck on this. And like, so that information like ends up coming out, and without having to like do it as a separate exercise, if that makes sense.
Right.
And do you do those like for the demo portion? Is that something that you do strictly within the team or with a larger group across teams and stuff?
So weekly we have a sort of show off your work, and it doesn't have to be finished work. I very much encourage like broken things, half done things, even nothing, like just tell me what you were trying to accomplish, even if you didn't do it. So we have that once a week with just our dev team. And it's like a demo, but we also really encourage discussion about it. And because no one else is invited, it's okay to pull up the code on your screen and like really get into the details,
Right.
and not have that feeling of like, oh, there's stakeholders on the call who won't be interested in this level of detail. Like there's no guilt about any of that. But then when we do sort of finish like a real sort of chunk of work or something that stands on its own, or that we think other stakeholders need to really understand well, or we're going to ship this thing, and so we have to sort of enact all the stuff down the rest of the line that has to happen, then we'll schedule just a separate meeting for that. Like, okay, feature ABC is ready to be turned on in production. And so let's have a demo meeting sort of end to end of feature ABC. And we're going to talk about why did we build this, and just, the whole big picture. But we do that as a separate thing. So the weekly one that's just the dev team, that is because we can get into that level of detail and show stuff that's like partly done. I think that's why the stand-up type information can come out there. So yeah, that's kind of one example of a team like ceremony or sync up or whatever, where we are sort of accomplishing the goals of stand-up, but it's not actually a stand-up. It's also accomplishing other things.
That makes sense, and I wanted to ask about the demos because this is always something that seems to come up in different forms where people are looking for different types of things out of demos, and it was interesting to hear that you have it specifically for the team, and the way that you talked about the immediate team, and the way that you talk about the types of content and what's being encouraged there. I feel like accomplishes a lot of goals that I've heard people asking about, but when people have different ideas of what those types of demo meetings are for, that's where it starts to get super messy, because I've heard people be like, well, we're not going to demo, it's not done. And it's like, well, okay, that makes sense if you're trying to show it to external stakeholders on different teams and stuff like that. But if you just want feedback and you want to just talk about progress and stuff, there's a lot of value in that. You don't have to just have a completely polished product. And you even talked about having people just talk, right? Like you're not even demoing something you've prepared. It's just like, here's the stuff I did. And I think there's a lot of value there.
Yeah, so I guess I was saying that there were a few different categories of things that make me feel like the stand-ups are redundant, and one of them is because we do cover that kind of thing sort of implicitly or sometimes explicitly at our other team meetings. Another one is just sort of the culture around collaboration. And so I don't think I've said this up to this point, but like my team is fully virtual. Like none of us work in an office at all. This team formed during the pandemic. And so a lot of the people don't actually live in the same cities. And so even if we so my company right now as well is in the middle of transitioning to different office space. And so there just is nowhere that you can work physically together. But even if there was, I'm not sure that this team would, because as I said, we're a little bit like distributed, nothing crazy, but just like a couple hours drive here and there and stuff like that. So yeah, the sort of, I'm just going to turn around and talk to somebody, or I can physically see that this person is rubbing their hair off of the top of their head or whatever. Like we don't have that. But we do have, like I said, just sort of a strong culture of teamwork. Honestly, like it sounds so cheesy, but this is really one of the first teams I've been on where that feels real. Like we are working on this together, as opposed to, I think what I've felt often in the past on different teams was, I'm working on this, you're working on this, that guy's working on this girl's working on this, and together that sort of adds up to something collaborative. But on this team, I really feel that the way we think about our work is that like we are all doing this together. And I try to, just encourage that in any way that I can. And I think I should give a lot of the credit to this group of people that I'm currently working with. Of course, I can say what I would like to see, but it's up to them to actually do it. And so, just in terms of if somebody is stuck on something throughout the day, it's very normal for that person to not be stuck for too long before they would post in a team channel and just say, hey, I'm like banging my head on the wall about this. Who's free? Who wants to jump on for a chat about this? And they will get volunteers. They will get at least one, often more. Sometimes just the whole team ends up being interested and jumps on and talk through it together. And so that's just something that's really normal on this team. And again, it sounds sort of like, of course, why wouldn't you raise your hand if you need help? But I think a lot of times other teams I've been on, it felt like I don't want to do that because I don't want to interrupt other people, or because I know that tomorrow morning we've set aside this time to talk about what we're blocked on. And so I'm just going to save it until then, kind of.
Yes.
But if you don't have that time set aside, you have to just ask it in sort of real time. And so I don't know if that's a bit of a like chicken and egg thing there, but yeah, that's just something that's very common. I'll see that multiple times a day in my team channel, is somebody raising their hand about having a blocker and then them getting help right away. So in our team, it would feel very strange to like wait until the next morning to ask for help. And so sort of like, because we aren't waiting till the next morning, we don't need the stand up for like giving the opportunity for people to say that they're stuck.
I think there's a huge thing there about like being, one, able to ask for help, and two, having multiple people or the whole team willing to pile on and give that help so quickly, around the difference between teams that feel like we are doing this thing together versus like we're doing a bunch of independent tasks. Because I've seen so many times you get to the end of a sprint and it almost feels like, okay, we missed our sprint. Like, why is that? It's like, oh, well, like, you know, Dave got his work done. Stacy got her work done. Oh, but like Mark's project was delayed. Like, let's dig into that. And there's this sense of like, we're not really winning or losing as a team because everyone had their own heads down things. And so that like idea of, hey, we're winning and losing together, I need help. And if I don't get help, like this piece of value that we as a team are delivering isn't getting moved forward, is like, yeah, it's so cool to hear you say that, because I've definitely worked on teams that feel on both sides of that. And just to be able as a manager to see people ask for help and then others like jump in and help. I don't know who would think this, but I'm sure there is this stigma that like mobbing a problem or whatever is like not a good use of all the developers' time, right? Like, oh, all these, like everyone should be getting lots of stuff done at the same time. And it's like, as a manager, at least in the style that I manage, it's so cool to see people get together and tackle a problem like that together. Yeah. So.
Yeah, that for sure makes me happy as a manager. And maybe that comes across, right? That I'm always thanking people, celebrating, talking about it, you know, when there's these things going on. Like, I don't know if your teams use Slack or if your teams use the
Teams,
Huddle,
the
Huddle
superior
feature
software.
that was, yeah. Anyway, a few months ago, Slack added this thing called Huddles. And so I'm talking about this because when you like look in Slack now, you can see sort of who's in a huddle because it has a little like icon next to their name. And so if I happen to go to Slack and I'm scrolling through my channels for something and I see that a bunch of individuals on my team all have that icon next to their name, I'm like, okay, I know they're all like swarming on something right now. And I just get this like happy feeling in my heart that, that my
I
team
see that
is
too.
working together.
But for me, it's always like, I'm the only one without the headphones. And I'm like, hey, hold on. Like, how do I get into this chat to see what's going on? Because I'm curious.
It's okay. They're probably just talking poorly about you.
Yeah, of course.
Well, so I haven't seen that in Slack, and I haven't used Slack recently. I used to regularly use it, but and I don't use Discord a lot, but that actually sounds like kind of the user interface for Discord when you can see the calls going on. You can see like, you know, there's just all these, you can see the people in the calls even if you're not in it, which is kind of interesting.
Well, and the way these huddles work, you can see if people are in a huddle and maybe they're in it together, right, with the two of them. But if a channel you're in has a huddle, you get a notification too, like someone started a huddle. So if you're using your team chat for that purpose and you see someone like that pops up in your team, that's another way to like be notified and know it's your group or the people about this specific
That's cool.
like, space. Yeah.
It's kind of an interesting replication of the ability, if you were all physically in the office together, of the ability to see that like this person is over at this person's desk and they're like physically huddling around a screen. But now you can sort of see that by just kind of if you happen to be checking Slack. So
that's really interesting.
this is a total tangent, but I was invited just to test a piece of software that somebody I knew was thinking about using for their team. And I've never seen this before, but basically when you log in, it drops you into like it looks like The Sims. And it drops you into this office space, and there's like labeled offices, and there's like a lounge, and there's like kind of a cafeteria, but you don't need to eat. But if you're in any of the public spaces, anybody else in the public space can hear through their headphones like what's being talked about, what's going on. But if you go into an office, only the people in that office can hear the conversation, but you can see like who's in various offices. And I don't know, like it feels a little bit gimmicky, but when I used it, I was actually like, oh, this is kind of cool. Like, and I think it's for that purpose, like Tina, what you're saying about the huddles is like, it's kind of the idea of like, oh, I can see who's around, and like, you can kind of hear what's taking place and join in on things if you think it might be relevant to you. I don't know if teams are going to go that way with the whole virtual Sims thing, but it was kind of neat.
And then there was a third thing that I was just going to mention around. So the first kind of category of reasons why we don't feel the need for a stand-up is other meetings. The second one is collaborative culture. And then the third one is just that I feel like I can, if I am interested at any point what the status of a piece of work is, I feel that there are places I can just go and like pull that information, sort of self-serve. And I don't know if it's because my team is using GitHub in any particularly special way, but if I am curious about how far along a piece of work is, I can find that out for myself by just going to our repo and seeing what's been going on a PR, right? So we have another thing we do in our team is it's pretty common to put up draft PRs of something you're sort of just partly finished. Again, this is something that's happening on my team, but has not necessarily been, or definitely not been the case in some teams that I've seen before. But in this team, it's very common that you'll just put up what you have so far, and then as you go, you'll be adding to it. And so I could see like what somebody's up to and how far along they are. Another thing is that our code reviews are intended to be quite in depth. I have been on teams where a code review was really just like, looks good to me. I don't really know what this is, but it built on my machine, so I guess it's cool. But in this team, I've tried really hard to promote the idea that this is a critical step in the process, and as much care should be put into a review as almost writing the code in the first place. And so there's a lot of conversation on PRs. Hey, did you think about this? Or we should talk offline about that, or there's just a lot of information there that I could, if I wanted to, I could really get a strong sense of what's been happening on a particular piece of work, how far along it is, who's been looking at it, what kinds of discussions are they having, are the review comments kind of like nitpicks, or are they, we should really sit down and talk about the architecture of this. And so by just looking at that kind of information, I'll be able to tell, like, is this going smoothly? And so again, to then meet in the morning at a scheduled stand-up and say these things that have already been written down in one of our work tools kind of feels awkward in a way, because it's like, well, everybody on this call already knows this, you know, and so is it just for the benefit of the manager potentially to like recap what's been going on in the PR discussion? That doesn't seem like a great use of time. Plus, I would rather just sort of read it when I have time throughout the day, or if I even need to know, like if things are going smoothly, maybe I don't, like, I'm not saying that I go spend all day like creeping what's happening on the PR discussions, but like if I needed to know or was interested in knowing or was curious about how I might be able to help support, then I could go get that information myself without having a meeting, I guess, is what it comes down to.
You just summarized something that really bothers me about stand-ups, which is like, you know, yesterday, like team member Y, like reviewed my code review. And every time I hear that, I'm like, yeah, I don't know if we need that. Like this, like we all have GitHub notifications and we're all like doing the thing. And those kinds of updates to me are always really interesting. But like, we did this thing that, like, I think you just kind of said it really well. It's just like we all already know.
Right, man. And it kind of sounds like there's a lot going on for code reviews and pull requests, which is cool because I agree that it's a spot where you can have those interactions, right? So with all of that going on, I'm making an assumption here, but I'm going to assume that it's actually not a high friction thing for people, or else they would have said, we don't like doing this. Like, we need to find a better way to work. So if it's low friction and you have potentially a lot of churn from like comments and, hey, we should go talk about this, I'm just really curious, like, how that might have evolved because, um, I've seen like even instances where it's not a ton of churn, but as soon as you have people like, hey, we got to talk about this offline. I know that I've talked with people that are like, I'm frustrated. Like, I don't like putting this person on the reviews because we always seem to have to go talk about stuff. And I'm like, well, I don't know. Like maybe it's hard to know, right? Because it could just be some personal interaction. It could be a systematic thing about some area of code, but it just sounds like your code review and PR processes are set up to be almost like collaborative in their design, right?
Yeah, like when you say that you're going to review somebody's work, you sort of then become the collaborator on that piece of work. And I would guess that by the end of the code review, you understand everything about this as well as the person who originally wrote it for the most part. We actually, at the risk of like going off on another tangent, we actually include testing in scope for code review.
Right.
There isn't a separate stage after code review for testing. As the dev, when you're the code reviewer, you're reviewing the code, you're also expected to do all of the testing that would make us feel comfortable to like merge this and release it.
Love it.
So yeah, you're going to get to know this really well. And it's as opposed to just like, I'm giving this a quick once over, like you're signing on for this piece of work too. And I guess I've always, since sort of starting this team, that's been one of my top priorities is making the review feel as important and as valuable as the initial writing of the code. Because honestly, in my experience in software teams over quite many years now, you either have that churn and invest that time and do the hard conversations and maybe it all takes a bit longer up front, or you're probably going to be spending that time later in an unexpected scenario where you're sort of like trying to resolve an issue that came up because you didn't have those conversations, because you didn't spend the time up front. And so you can sort of, as a team, make that choice. Like, do you want to do this now when it hasn't shipped yet, or do you want to roll the dice and see if it just happens later instead? And I guess I've been through too many of the let's just roll the dice situations where it always seems to come back. And so, yeah, for me, I don't want to work that way anymore.
Well, it's like you'll get somebody, the next person to touch that area of code being like, oh, I would like to refactor this. And then there's that conversation anyways. And maybe they end up spending time changing something that could have more easily been changed at initial development time. I used to describe this to my team at Circle CI sort of similarly. We didn't put as much diligence as you put in. Definitely, I can say that safely. But one of the things I told people who were doing the code reviews is, listen, like, we're a SaaS team. When you say looks good to me and the code goes in, just know that at some point in the next 3 to 4 weeks, you're holding the pager. And if there's an incident, like, you own this thing that's going in. So like, treat the code reviews like a bar to entry that you would feel comfortable with owning it, because you, once it's shipped, effectively do own it. So that was kind of my framing for a very similar thing.
Yeah, and actually that's a great point. That might be something that's a key difference about the team that I'm working with right now compared to any other team I've been on before, is that we are everything to this product. So it's a new product that we wrote the first line of code for, 2.5 years ago. And we are the only team. There are no other teams helping with deployment, with building the CI pipeline, with ops, with like, it's just us. And I've always worked at larger companies where they were large enough that those types of functions had started to become like their own thing in their own teams. And so, yeah, like absolutely, if you're reviewing some code and you know that potentially next week you're going to be the one that's responsible for doing the release to production, and you're like, so, you know, similar to, this isn't probably super unique, but just we have every dev on the team, they take a turn to be sort of the ops person for a week, right? And so it could be you, and you know, you're on the hook sort of course, not really, because like I said, we're very collaborative, and when bugs come up, everybody helps, but still, you're sort of the first responder for 1 week out of every however many people we have on the team. We all take turns. So yeah, maybe that's a key thing, is that you're going to feel motivated to really invest in making sure that this gets done right, because you know that there's nobody else. It's not going to be somebody else's problem ever. It's only going to come back to haunt you and your teammates if it's not done well.
Well, that example of like on call and even the pull requests and code reviews all kind of comes back to that, like that shared ownership piece, right? Shared ownership and shared like goal. Like it's not a bunch of individuals working on individual things. I can't speak. It's actually like the team feels like they're rallying behind the same thing. And I don't know, when I heard it in the beginning when we were chatting through it, I was like, that seems like one good point, okay, but it seems like it's actually a common thing across all of these pieces, like when you start kind of breaking them down. Because I was thinking, okay, like even take the pull request example. I really like what you were saying, Tina, about you know, if you're going to sign off on this, it's kind of like you become a collaborator, like you kind of have this shared ownership. You're going through like other parts that maybe weren't just writing all of the code initially, but you're doing these other pieces. And I was thinking, well, isn't that going to feel like a high friction thing for someone? And it won't if they're already embodying the fact that this is a shared goal, a shared purpose, and you know, it's just moving the whole team forward. If you were looking at it like, oh, if I go help Ted, I don't know who Ted is, but if I have to go help Ted on his thing and I have to go sign off on this pull request and that means I'm responsible, like what about all my other work that's totally unrelated, but interestingly enough is still part of another like OKR or something that we have to deliver on? Like, I mean, it's just going to put me further behind. So like, yeah, I'll just sign off on this. Otherwise it's high friction. So it does all seem to come back to that, which is super cool.
I think part of what enables you to feel like you can or you want to or it's relevant to really dive in on someone else's PR is if yours isn't that far disconnected from it. And that's something that I've struggled with, but have been like trying my absolute hardest to sort of wrangle on this team, is that let's not be a team where, you know, each person on the team is working on a completely different feature. And maybe we're moving 10 things along a tiny bit per week. And maybe that's good in some situations, but I've found that just really being diligent about cutting down the number of distinct things that our team is trying to do right now helps with that collaboration piece. And even coming back to stand-ups, like if I'm working on something that's very closely related to what you're working on, I probably already know what you've been up to over the last day, because like we have to talk about our code and how it's going to connect because it's closely related. And so just keeping the number of areas in progress small when you can. I mean, that can get messy too. Like now we're all trampling over each other. So it's a very delicate balance, but trying to find that point where I can jump in on your PR and be very detailed and even opinionated about how you've done it because I'm working on something that's going to connect up with it in the not too distant future. That kind of helps as well. And that's something a bit different that I've done on this team as well, because again, in the past, I've very often had that situation of every person's doing completely their own thing. And maybe I know a lot of people who actually prefer that, because then it's like, this is my lane and I'm staying in here and I don't need to worry too much about what others are doing. But I haven't had as much success with that kind of situation.
I had a team I did a lot of paired programming and mob programming, and people would spend much of their days like on a Zoom and on like a VS Code share writing code together. And at one point someone floated the idea, hey, if there's 2 or 3 of us working on this thing, do we even have to have code reviews? And it was like, so I was like, oh, what, like, wow, what a great question. Like, not really, because you're doing the review in real time and there's 2 or 3 sets of eyes on it. And that was just another example of people looking at ceremonial things and saying, like, actually, we're kind of finding another way to do this. And it actually feels more efficient to have multiple people just work on it up front. So
I saw someone, I don't know who it was, but I saw on LinkedIn or something, someone was like aggressively saying like code reviews and pull requests are like the worst thing that's ever happened. Like they're so ineffective. And I remember being like, man, like I feel like it's a pretty good spot to like have these checkpoints and stuff. But I think when you frame it as, Graham, as you were just saying, I can totally get behind that personally, because I've been in situations on smaller teams where I'll use Justin. So Graham and I used to work with Justin would sit behind me and I knew what he was working on. Again, this similar situation where we didn't need stand-ups, but I knew what he was working on to the point where like I knew how he was writing his code. So we would be talking about things, and by the time it went up for review, I'm like, I'm literally not surprised by anything I'm seeing here. I know the types of design patterns you're using for the systems we're talking about. If anything, it would be like, I thought you were talking about adding tests or something for this specific thing, and I don't see that. You added a bunch of tests for other stuff, but I think you just forgot that. And by the time it came to review the code, it was so quick that it didn't really matter.
So, Tina, I was going to play devil's advocate for a second. I think you actually answered the question with the third group of like that you addressed with the whole, like, I can get the information I need somewhere else. But there are probably inevitably managers who have come from more of the command and control style environment. And I suspect a response might be, if you don't hear updates from the team every day about what they've done and what they're doing, like, how do you know that they're working and that they're working like on the right stuff? And I don't know if you have like further thoughts about that.
You can see that through the mouse moving software, right? You just watch the mouse tracking and it must be doing
totally.
work.
I'm definitely doing that. No, it's a good question. And I will say that there are times where maybe there's somebody who just isn't quite as communicative or is, for whatever reason, just kind of like heads down on something for a few days. And I'll be like, you know what? I actually don't know how their work is going right now. Mm-hmm. And so then I will just ask them. And,
so novel.
Yeah. So for some people, maybe I'm doing that a little more often. Some examples might be like they're new to the team, or they're very junior, or they're somebody who just likes to be like having a sort of that confirmation on a regular basis. Yeah, I'm doing the most important thing. Or somebody who's maybe nervous about like I said, we have a strong culture of just like put your hand up if you're stuck and somebody will help you. There's still like some anxiety around that, and more so with some people than others, but just like hesitating to do that, to raise their hand for a variety of factors, just personality or being new to the team, some of the things I've already said. So yeah, like if I ever get that feeling of I don't really know how this particular piece of work is going, or I don't know what this particular person's been doing this week, I don't want to make sure they're not frustrated or nothing's up, or I just want to offer support or something, then yeah, I'll just connect with 1 or 2 people that I need to or want to. And then that's it, basically, is just have that quick check-in, and often it'll be, 5 minutes or even just a Slack message or two, and then that can resolve any time where it feels like there's a gap in information flow for whatever reason. And you don't have to bring the whole team together.
Right.
Yeah.
You're suggesting managing individuals. That's like, it's funny, but it's like, yeah, it can be that simple, apparently.
I had hopefully a quick question, but it came up in the beginning and kind of came up again. And maybe, Tina, we can get your input on it before we kind of go to summarizing the points we've been chatting about. But one of the things that I heard you say towards the beginning and just recently was about kind of going back to this feeling of like, I want to ask for help, and having people on the team like responding, and like no one being afraid to ask for help, it seems like, and the response of the team usually being that everyone's jumping in on it. And I'm curious because I don't know. So something I've observed, and I don't know if it has to do with just strictly remote nature of work, or maybe people's sort of earliness in career kind of thing. But I'm curious because I've experienced a handful of situations where folks are being very reserved. Like they're not reaching out to ask for help, and you have to keep kind of poking them. And it's like the feedback over time ends up being generalized as like, I didn't want to bother people. No matter how many times and how many forums and how many different ways we try to say like, look, everyone's here to help. And it just doesn't seem to be the case that people believe it. And I don't know if maybe it's because people aren't actually embodying the other side of it, but I was really curious to hear your perspective on, it can't just be a remote thing because your team is fully remote. But I wanted to get your insight.
Yeah, so definitely there's people who struggle with it. Like, is it time to ask for help? Have I done enough of my own research? And I think it's something you touched on, like earliness in career or even earliness on the team. I think what happens, I think, is because they know that when they raise their hand, they will get a lot of response. It's like they want to choose that moment carefully because they know that it's going to impact other people's day when they raise their hand. But it's the people who are new in career or new on the team who feel maybe badly about it because they know that they're not yet in a place where they can reciprocate. So like it feels different if you're going to raise your hand and ask for help and you know others are going to put down what they're doing and come and help you. If you know that tomorrow that person who just helped you might be stuck and then you can help them. But as the new person, it's sort of a bit more one way, right? And so then I think that's what makes people hesitate sometimes is like, am I going to ask again, really? Because like I haven't helped anyone else since last time I asked. And it's just kind of, I don't know. For me as their leader, I try to really reward them when they do it, I guess, and just not only say it's okay if you do this, but like, thank you for doing this. This really helped us as a team to move along with our goals, and just really focusing on why this is the way it has to be when you start out, is that you are going to be taking more than you're giving, but then looking for those times or situations where they can be on the other side of it. Like even if it's a small thing, just finding ways for them to help out the team, or even if it's like not maybe responding to somebody else's distress call, but like, could you update this documentation because you were new and you found that this part of it was outdated and nobody else had looked at it in a while? Can you just finding wins for them, things they can do to help the team, to sort of help them feel like their bank account, so to speak, is a little more even, that like they're not only taking away, and then they start to feel more comfortable to ask for help when they need to and not have that like, oh, I don't want to bother people feeling. I think that I don't want to bother people feeling goes away if you know that other people bother you sometimes and that like it's okay. This is just how we work together.
Right. Yeah, I think that was a really good piece of I don't know, insight that I certainly hadn't considered before, was sort of the explanation for why people might feel that way. And it's almost like if I'm constantly taking and I have nothing to give back, then I feel bad about it. And that's interesting because I've been routinely hearing like, I don't want to bother this person again. I don't want to bother this person again. And I'm like they're not bothered by it. And if you feel that way, like bother me instead. Like I'm like, I can code, like get on a call with me anytime you want, but then they don't bother me. And I'm like, well, and maybe it's because of this reasoning you're saying where it's like, they're not in a state yet where they feel like they can give back in the same fashion. So it just always ends up feeling like really bad to be like, I have to ask again. Yeah, no, that's cool.
Yeah, and finding those situations where you have to always go to this person for this thing, and so the team feels bad, like, oh, I have to ask this person again about this topic. Well, do something about that. So that, is it writing something down? Is it changing that code so that it's a little less like weird to understand, or like fixing the root as well can help, and having the person who maybe felt bad about asking for help be part of that. Like, okay, ask them for help this one more time, but write down what they tell you and then share that with the rest of the team, and just having them feel like they're making some sort of progress towards a contribution, I guess.
And that's like a double whammy where if they can get the help and then provide that help to the team, even if the rest of the team didn't need it in that moment, like, hey, look, here's an example where you're giving back and sort of fulfilling that thing that you thought you weren't doing. That's really cool. So I think as you were chatting through a bunch of the topics, you had mentioned there were probably like 3 primary things that kind of set you and your team up to not really have to do stand-ups. And one in particular was certainly like just the cadence of other meetings and things that you already have are kind of set up to try and touch on some of those things that might include demos. What were the other things? Maybe we can just recap on those to do a little bit of a summary, and I think that would be really helpful for people that are tuning in.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, the first sort of group of things was that we just have other opportunities throughout the week where we're regularly getting together. And although the focus of that conversation might not be, hey, every person has to give a stand-up type update, some of that same information does still come out, even though maybe the stated goal of the talk was something else.
Right.
And then another one is just the culture around helping each other when you're stuck right away, rather than waiting until the next morning to ask about it at stand-up, because, well, there is no stand-up, so there isn't this time that you should save it for. It's like, ask about it now, because there is no time where everyone's going to put pencils down and ask about blockers. So that was the other one, was just the culture of you should raise it now, and also that when you do raise it, you're going to get a positive response from the team, like, hey, thanks for letting us know you're stuck. Let's all jump on this and work on it together. And that feeling that we are working on things, and we actually are working together on things. We're not splitting the team across, like, everybody's doing a totally different piece of work right now. And then the other one was just around, the information about who's doing what, how far along it is, how it's going, what they might be stuck on, is actually available in a sort of pull model or self-serve model. If I just go and look at the activity in our GitHub repo. And part of that is because I expect that code reviews are very collaborative and very detailed, and so just as a result of that, there's a lot of artifacts in there that are like showing the detailed discussion that's going on for each piece of work, and there is a lot of conversation. It's not, as I said before, just one person doing their own thing. So yeah, I think those were the 3 kind of key areas.
Yeah, that's great. I think for myself, I have 2 specific takeaways that I'm going to try to implement, I think. One of them is going to be explicitly like being thankful for people when they're acknowledging that they're blocked, because sometimes I think there's a pattern of maybe waiting a little bit too long. So as people start to do it, I want to encourage, like, thank you for raising it. And instead of just answering and having people chime in and answer, like actually publicly thank people for doing it. And then I think the other thing too is sort of that model of when people are getting that assistance, being able to say, hey, like go share that with the rest of the team, like finding those opportunities where people can give back. You kind of use the bank account analogy to be able to kind of put themselves in that position where they're like, hey, I'm not just taking here, I am providing information. And I think those are two relatively easy things that I can jump into right away and try to make some positive improvements.
I'm a notoriously uncreative and much more systematic thinker. And a lot of what I heard in this conversation that has got my wheels turning is I get really stuck on, I don't believe in doing like agile for the sake of agile. I actually rail against this all the time. However, I am stuck in this thinking of like, well, there's stand-up meetings and there's like sprint planning and there's retros and there's demos, and they all have to go very specific ways. And I think just reflecting on the fact that, hey, maybe instead of my team right now is really kind of stuck in like half-hour long stand-ups every day. And maybe instead of a half-hour stand-up every day, if we can take 45 minutes at the end of the week and demo what we've been up to, even that is huge. So super stoked to think about other ways that the team can collaborate. For me, the number one thing that has had me holding on to stand-ups, because I agree with a lot of the points about the redundancy in information, is the face-to-face for the team. In remote settings, it's like, I don't know where else people get that daily face-to-face. So the stand-up kind of serves for that purpose. But knowing that there are alternatives and just laying the groundwork so we can eventually move into those instead of this kind of like horribly boring status update meeting for a half hour every day is a pretty big goal of mine. So this has been super helpful.
Yeah, thank you, Tina. I think a lot for us to, continue to think about and try to see if we can find creative ways to implement things. So I know Graham and I will probably keep chatting about things over the upcoming weeks and months, being like, hey, did you try doing that thing? And how did that go for you? So yeah, this has been very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, it's been a great conversation. And I should say maybe before we close that I'm not here to say stand-ups are bad or wrong or anything. As I've said, I've been on lots of teams where we relied very heavily on them. And depending on your team culture and preferences and everything, stand-ups may be a great tool for you. It was just that in this current team, with the way that we've set up the culture and the cadence of our work and other ceremonies and things, they became redundant. And so That's just been an interesting new experience for me. But yeah, I'm not here to say if you're doing stand-ups, your team is doing it wrong.
No, we'll say that.
Yeah. No, that's cool. Well, thank you, Tina.
Thanks for having me. Great to talk.
Nick, do you want to do the like and subscribe reminder before we stop recording?
Maybe I'll do that before we stop recording. So yeah, thanks, Graham. So now I'm gonna mess it up, right? So yeah, thanks for watching. If you can like the video, that'd be very much appreciated. If you're on YouTube and you want to subscribe to the channel, that'd be awesome. And of course, comments, for the algorithm, right? And we will respond to them too. So if you have criticisms, maybe you're very pro stand-up and want to see things done a very different way, we'll fight you in the comments about it. Yeah. No, just kidding. But we'd love to have a conversation and hear different viewpoints. So that would be great. So thanks, and we'll see you next time.